The dust rose in small clouds around Teresa Lawson's boots as she walked across the endless Arizona desert, the afternoon sun beating down on her shoulders with relentless intensity. And she wondered distantly if this was how she would die, alone and forgotten in the middle of nowhere with nothing but the vultures to mark her passing. Behind her, 3 days back, lay the charred remains of the homestead where she had buried her father, his lungs finally giving out after 2 years of fighting the consumption that had brought them west in the first place. Ahead, according to the map he had drawn with shaking hands 2 days before his death, lay the town of Wilcox, Arizona, where her father's brother supposedly ran a general store and might take in a 22-year-old woman with nothing to her name but the clothes on her back and a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, a Bible, and her mother's wedding ring. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn, shading her eyes against the September glare of 1883. A rider approached from the east, his horse moving at an easy canter across the scrubland. Teresa's hand went instinctively to the small knife tucked into her boot, the only weapon she possessed, though she knew it would do little good if the rider meant harm. Out here, a woman alone was vulnerable in ways that made her stomach clench with fear she refused to acknowledge. The horse slowed as it drew near, and the rider pulled back on the reins until the animal was walking, matching her pace exactly. Teresa kept her eyes forward, her chin raised, refusing to show the terror that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "Mighty hot day for walking," the rider said. His voice was low, pleasant, with a hint of something that might have been concern. "Nearest town is still a good 15 miles ahead." Teresa risked a glance at him. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly under the brim of his hat, and eyes the color of creek water in summer. His face was tanned from long hours in the sun, and he sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He wore dusty trail clothes, a 6-shooter at his hip, and had the lean, rangy build of someone who worked hard for a living. "I am aware of the distance," Teresa said, keeping her voice level. "I have been walking since dawn." "That is a long walk with no water," he gestured to her empty hands. "You do not even have a canteen." "I had one. It ran dry 2 hours ago." The cowboy reached behind him and unhooked a leather-covered canteen from his saddle. He held it out to her, and when she hesitated, he said, "I have another. My horse and I started out well supplied this morning." Teresa's pride warred with her thirst, and thirst won. She took the canteen with a murmured thanks and drank deeply, the lukewarm water tasting better than champagne. When she lowered it, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. "I appreciate your kindness." "Keep it," he said. "I have got plenty, and you clearly need it more than I do. I am Isaac Sullivan, by the way. I work at the Diamond S Ranch about 10 miles north of Wilcox. Teresa Lawson. I am heading to Wilcox myself. Alone." The concern in his voice was unmistakable now. "Begging your pardon, Miss Lawson, but that is not safe country for a woman traveling by herself." "I did not have much choice in the matter." Teresa heard the edge in her own voice and softened it slightly. "My circumstances are not ideal, but they are what they are." Isaac was silent for a moment, his horse continuing to walk alongside her. "If you do not mind my asking, where did you start from? There is nothing but empty country for 30 miles in any direction." "My father's homestead," or what was his homestead? Teresa kept her eyes on the horizon, unwilling to let this stranger see the grief that still felt too raw, too overwhelming to examine closely. "He passed 3 days ago. I buried him and started walking. I am sorry for your loss." The simple words carried a weight of genuine sympathy. "That is a hard thing, to lose family out here," Teresa nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They walked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and the creak of leather saddle. "I cannot in good conscience leave you to walk 15 miles in this heat," Isaac said finally. "Would you allow me to give you a ride into town? My horse can carry double for that distance, and I was heading to Wilcox anyway to pick up supplies." Every instinct Teresa possessed warned her against accepting help from a stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. But the sun was merciless. Her feet ached in boots that had never been meant for long-distance walking, and she knew with bleak certainty that she might not make it to Wilcox before nightfall if she continued on foot. Traveling after dark in Apache territory was a death sentence. "I would appreciate that," she said quietly. "Thank you." Isaac dismounted with fluid grace and offered his hand to help her up. His palm was calloused, his grip firm but gentle. He swung up behind her, reaching around to gather the reins, and Teresa found herself acutely aware of his presence at her back, the warmth of him in the cooling afternoon air. The horse moved into a comfortable walk, and Isaac kept a respectful distance between them despite the close quarters. "You said you have family in Wilcox," he asked. "An uncle, my father's brother. He runs a general store, or at least he did the last time my father heard from him, which was 4 years ago." "That would be Douglas Lawson," Isaac said. "He does indeed run the general store. Good man, fair in his dealings. A bit gruff, but decent." Relief flooded through Teresa. "You know him." "Everyone in Wilcox knows everyone else. It is not a large town, maybe 300 people on a busy day. Your uncle is well respected. I am sure he will be glad to see you." Teresa was not so certain of that, but she kept her doubts to herself. She knew nothing of Douglas Lawson except what her father had told her, which amounted to little more than the fact that he existed and ran a store in Wilcox. Whether he would welcome an unexpected niece was another matter entirely. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the landscape gradually changing as they drew closer to civilization. Scrub brush gave way to occasional stands of cottonwood trees, and in the distance, Teresa could see the faint shimmer that suggested water. "The San Pedro River," Isaac said, noticing her gaze. "Wilcox sits just east of it. The town has been growing since the railroad came through 2 years ago. We have got a good mix of ranchers, farmers, and railroad workers now." "Have you been here long?" Teresa asked. 3 years. I came out from Missouri after my parents died. My older brother had already established himself at the Diamond S, and he wrote to say they were hiring. I have been there ever since, working my way up from stable hand to segundo." Segundo? Teresa was unfamiliar with the term. "Second in command after the foreman. It is good work, and the owner is a fair man. I have been saving my wages, hoping to buy my own spread someday." There was pride in his voice, the kind that came from honest labor and legitimate ambition. Teresa found herself relaxing slightly, her initial wariness easing. Isaac Sullivan seemed to be exactly what he appeared to be, a decent man who had stopped to help someone in need. "What about you?" Isaac asked. "What will you do in Wilcox, besides live with your uncle?" "I do not know," Teresa admitted. "I can read and write, and I have a fair hand at figures. I can sew and cook and keep house. I suppose I will find work doing something." "The school teacher just left to get married and move to Tucson," Isaac said thoughtfully. "The town has been looking for a replacement. The pay is not much, but it comes with a small house and the respect of the community." Hope flickered in Teresa's chest. "I have never taught before, but I attended school through the 10th grade back in Missouri. My mother was a teacher before she married. That is more education than most folks out here have. You should talk to Mayor Hendricks when you get settled. He is heading up the search committee." The sun was lowering toward the western horizon when the buildings of Wilcox finally came into view. It was larger than Teresa had expected, with a main street lined with false-fronted buildings and several side streets branching off into residential areas. She could see a church steeple rising above the other structures, and in the distance, the distinctive water tower that marked the railroad depot. Isaac guided his horse down the main street, which was busy with late afternoon activity. Wagons rattled past, men stood talking outside the saloon, and women in calico dresses carried baskets from the general store. Several people called greetings to Isaac, their eyes curious as they took in his passenger. "The general store is just ahead," Isaac said, pointing to a large building with Lawson's Mercantile painted across the front. "Would you like me to go in with you?" Teresa hesitated, then shook her head. "Thank you, but I should meet my uncle alone." "I cannot tell you how grateful I am for your help, Mr. Sullivan. You may have saved my life today." "Just being a decent human being," Isaac said, but he looked pleased. He brought his horse to a stop in front of the store and dismounted, then helped Teresa down. Her legs were shaky after the long ride, and she had to steady herself against the horse for a moment. Isaac retrieved her carpet bag from where he had tied it to his saddle and handed it to her. "If things do not work out with your uncle, come find me at the Diamond S. The ranch owner's wife is always looking for help with the house and the cooking, and she is a kind woman. You would be safe there." The offer brought unexpected tears to Teresa's eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "That is very kind. Take care of yourself, Miss Lawson. I hope to see you around town." He tipped his hat to her, swung back into the saddle, and rode off down the street, leaving Teresa standing in front of the general store with her heart beating hard against her ribs. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked through the door. The interior of the store was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took Teresa's eyes a moment to adjust. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from bolts of fabric to canned goods to farming implements. The smell of coffee and tobacco and leather filled the air. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 40s with thinning brown hair and the same blue eyes Teresa saw in the mirror every morning. He looked up as she approached, his expression professionally pleasant. "Can I help you, miss? Uncle Douglas." Teresa's voice came out smaller than she intended. "I am Teresa, your brother James's daughter." The color drained from Douglas Lawson's face. He stared at her for a long moment, then came around the counter with quick steps. "Teresa, little Teresa, but you were just a child when I saw you last. James brought you through on the way to his homestead. Must have been 5 years ago now." "6, Teresa said. "I was 16. You have grown into the image of your mother." Douglas's voice was rough with emotion. "Where is your father? Is he in town?" "He died 3 days ago. The consumption finally took him. I buried him at the homestead and came here. You were the only family I knew to find." Douglas's face crumpled, and he reached out to pull Teresa into an unexpected embrace. "That damned stubborn fool. I told him the dry air would not save him if the sickness had already taken hold. I am so sorry, girl. James was a good man, even if he was too proud for his own good." Teresa found herself crying against her uncle's shoulder. All the grief and fear and exhaustion of the past 3 days finally breaking through the wall she had built to keep herself moving forward. Douglas patted her back awkwardly, making soothing noises, and when she finally pulled away, he pressed a handkerchief into her hand. "You will stay with me, of course," he said firmly. "I have a house behind the store, plenty of room. It is not fancy, but it is comfortable. You are family, Teresa, and you are welcome here for as long as you need." The relief was so intense it made Teresa's knees weak. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was so afraid you would not want me." "Not want you. You are my brother's daughter, the only family I have left in this world. Of course I want you here." Douglas squeezed her shoulder gently. "Come on, let me close up the store and I will take you to the house. You look like you could use a hot meal and a good night's sleep." As Douglas locked the front door and led her through the back of the store to the neat adobe house behind it, Teresa felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. She had a home, at least for now. She had a place to rest and recover and figure out what came next. That night, after a dinner of beef stew and fresh bread, Teresa lay in a real bed for the first time in weeks and thought about Isaac Sullivan. She remembered the kindness in his eyes, the gentleness of his hands as he helped her onto his horse, the way he had offered her safety without asking for anything in return. She knew she would likely see him around town, and the thought brought a small smile to her lips as she drifted off to sleep. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Douglas introduced Teresa to everyone in town, and she quickly learned that Wilcox was exactly as Isaac had described. A small, tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. The news of her arrival and her father's death spread quickly, and she found herself the recipient of numerous casseroles, pies, and offers of help from women she had never met. Douglas put her to work in the store, teaching her the inventory and the prices, and how to deal with the various customers who came through. Teresa discovered she had a knack for the work, her quick mind easily keeping track of accounts and orders. She also discovered that she enjoyed interacting with people, learning their stories and their needs. She saw Isaac Sullivan 3 times during those first 2 weeks. The first time was 5 days after her arrival, when he came into the store to buy tobacco and coffee. His face lit up when he saw her behind the counter, and they talked for several minutes about how she was settling in. The second time was at church the following Sunday, where he tipped his hat to her from across the sanctuary, and she felt her cheeks warm at his smile. The third time was purely by chance, when she was walking back from the post office and nearly collided with him coming out of the bank. "Miss Lawson," he said, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "I apologize. I should have been watching where I was going." "No harm done," Teresa said, acutely aware of the warmth of his hand through the fabric of her sleeve. "I was not paying attention either. How are you settling in? Your uncle treating you well?" "Very well. He has been wonderfully kind. I have been helping him in the store, and I spoke with Mayor Hendricks about the teaching position. He says the school board will make a decision by the end of the month." "That is good news. I hope you get it. The children around here could use a good teacher." They stood on the boardwalk, neither quite ready to walk away, until a woman's voice called Isaac's name. He turned, and Teresa saw a pretty blonde woman in an expensive dress waving at him from across the street. "That is Catherine Winters," Isaac said, and something in his tone made Teresa look at him sharply. "Her father owns the bank. I should go speak with her." "Of course," Teresa said, stepping back. "It was good to see you, Mr. Sullivan." She walked away quickly, telling herself she had no reason to feel disappointed. Isaac Sullivan had been kind to her, nothing more. The fact that a wealthy banker's daughter was clearly interested in him was none of her business. But that night, as she lay in bed, she found herself thinking about the way Isaac's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and the sound of his laugh, and the gentle strength in his hands. She told herself firmly to stop being foolish. She had known the man for all of 2 weeks, spoken to him perhaps a dozen times. Whatever she was feeling was simply gratitude for his initial kindness, nothing more. 3 days later, Douglas came into the kitchen where Teresa was preparing dinner and handed her a telegram. "This just came for you." "It is from the school board." Teresa's hands shook as she opened it. She read the brief message twice, then looked up at her uncle with shining eyes. They are offering me the position. I start the first Monday in October. Douglas swept her into a hug, laughing. That is wonderful news. I knew they would be fools not to hire you. We need to celebrate. How about we go to the hotel dining room for supper tonight? My treat. The hotel dining room was the nicest restaurant in Wilcox, and Teresa had never been inside. She changed into her best dress, a dark green calico that her mother had made years ago, and brushed her hair until it shone. Douglas offered her his arm with exaggerated formality, making her laugh, and they walked the 3 blocks to the hotel. The dining room was about half full, with white tablecloths and actual glass windows overlooking the main street. The waiter seated them at a table near the window, and Teresa was studying the menu when a familiar voice said, "Douglas, Miss Lawson, what a pleasant surprise." She looked up to find Isaac Sullivan standing beside their table, hat in hand. He wore a clean shirt and vest, and his hair was still damp from washing. He looked nervous, Teresa realized with a jolt of surprise. "Isaac," Douglas said warmly. "Good to see you, boy. We are celebrating." Teresa just got hired as the new schoolteacher. "That is wonderful," Isaac said, and the pleasure in his voice sounded genuine. "Congratulations, Miss Lawson. The children are lucky to have you. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." There was a brief, awkward pause, and then Isaac said, "I do not suppose you would both like to join me. I am dining alone, and it would be nice to have company." Douglas glanced at Teresa, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "We would be delighted," Douglas said, gesturing to the empty chairs at their table. Isaac sat down, and the waiter brought another menu. The conversation flowed easily, with Douglas and Isaac discussing ranch business and cattle prices while Teresa listened. She learned that Isaac had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, that his parents had died in a typhoid outbreak when he was 19, and that he had 2 sisters who had married and moved to different territories. "What about you, Miss Lawson?" Isaac asked when the food arrived. "What was life like in Missouri before you came west?" Teresa told them about growing up in a small town outside of St. Louis, about her mother's death when she was 14, about her father's increasing illness and his determination to try the Arizona climate. She found herself talking more than she had in months, drawn out by Isaac's genuine interest and thoughtful questions. They were finishing dessert when Catherine Winters entered the dining room with an older couple who were clearly her parents. She saw Isaac immediately, and her face brightened. She excused herself from her parents and came directly to their table. "Isaac," she said, her voice sweet as honey, "I did not expect to see you here tonight." "Miss Winters," Isaac said, standing politely, "may I introduce Miss Teresa Lawson? She is Douglas's niece and the new schoolteacher." "Miss Lawson, this is Catherine Winters." "Charmed," Catherine said, barely glancing at Teresa. Her entire focus was on Isaac. "I was hoping I might see you at the church social this Sunday. You did promise me a dance the last time we spoke." "I will be there," Isaac said, but Teresa noticed he did not quite confirm the promise of a dance. Catherine smiled triumphantly and returned to her parents, throwing one more glance at Isaac over her shoulder. Teresa felt her appetite for the peach cobbler in front of her suddenly disappear. The walk home was quiet, with Douglas whistling tunelessly and Teresa lost in her own thoughts. It was none of her business if Isaac Sullivan courted Catherine Winters. The banker's daughter was pretty and wealthy and clearly interested in him. It made perfect sense. But the realization did nothing to ease the strange ache in Teresa's chest. The church social on Sunday was the biggest event Wilcox had seen in months. Tables laden with food filled the churchyard. Children ran shrieking between the adults, and a small group of musicians tuned their instruments for the dancing that would start once the sun went down. Teresa helped her uncle set up his contribution to the food table, trying not to scan the crowd for a familiar dark-haired cowboy. She saw him finally, standing with a group of men near the church steps. He was laughing at something one of them had said, and the sight of him made her heart do an odd little skip. She looked away quickly, annoyed with herself. Teresa Lawson, as I live and breathe. The voice was female, warm and unfamiliar. Teresa turned to find a petite woman with auburn hair and laugh lines around her eyes. I am Mary Henderson. My husband owns the Diamond S Ranch where Isaac Sullivan works. I have been meaning to come introduce myself, but we have been so busy with the fall roundup. It is a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Henderson, Teresa said, shaking the offered hand. Please call me Mary. I heard you are starting as the school teacher next week. That is wonderful news. We have been without a proper teacher for months now. My youngest Tommy is 7 and has been running wild without school to occupy him. They chatted for several minutes, and Teresa found herself genuinely liking Mary Henderson. The older woman was warm and funny, with a down-to-earth manner that put Teresa immediately at ease. She introduced Teresa to several other women, and soon Teresa was caught up in a whirlwind of names and faces and welcoming smiles. When the dancing started, Teresa found herself partnered with various men from town. She danced with the blacksmith, the deputy sheriff, and even Mayor Hendricks. She was catching her breath between sets when Isaac appeared at her elbow. May I have this dance, Miss Lawson? Teresa's heart jumped. I would like that. He took her hand and led her into the circle of dancers. The music was a simple waltz, and Isaac moved with surprising grace for a man who spent his days on horseback. They did not speak at first, both focused on the steps and the movement of the dance. You look beautiful tonight, Isaac said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. That blue brings out the color of your eyes. Teresa felt heat rise in her cheeks. Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Sullivan. I think after sharing a horse for 15 miles and having dinner together, you might call me Isaac. Only if you call me Teresa. Teresa, he said, testing out the name. It suits you. They turned in the dance, and Teresa caught a glimpse of Catherine Winters standing at the edge of the crowd, her pretty face set in hard lines. The other woman was watching them with obvious displeasure. I believe Miss Winters is waiting for you, Teresa said quietly. Isaac glanced in Catherine's direction, and something like irritation crossed his face. Miss Winters has certain expectations that I have not encouraged. She seems quite taken with you. Her father would like to see her married to someone respectable who might be brought into the family business. I am not interested in banking or in marriage for business purposes. The music ended, and they separated reluctantly. Catherine immediately swooped in, claiming Isaac's arm with a proprietary air. Teresa turned away, unwilling to watch whatever came next. She found Mary Henderson standing nearby with a knowing smile on her face. That boy is smitten with you, Mary said bluntly. I have known Isaac Sullivan for 3 years, and I have never seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you. He hardly knows me, Teresa protested. Sometimes that is how it works. My husband took one look at me at a barn dance in Texas and told his best friend he had just met the woman he was going to marry. We were wed 3 months later, and that was 22 years ago. Mary squeezed Teresa's arm gently. Do not close your heart just because it seems too quick or too improbable. Some things are meant to be. Teresa thought about those words as she lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of the desert outside her window. She had known Isaac for less than a month, but Mary was right. There was something there, something that sparked between them whenever they were in the same room. It terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. The school year started on the first Monday of October, and Teresa threw herself into teaching with fierce determination. She had 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, children of ranchers and railroad workers and shopkeepers. They were a rowdy bunch at first, testing the new teacher, but Teresa was firm and fair and patient. Within 2 weeks, she had won them over. She saw Isaac occasionally around town, always in passing. They would exchange pleasantries, perhaps a few sentences of conversation, and then move on. It was not enough, Teresa thought. She wanted more time with him, more chances to talk and laugh and learn about the man behind those Summer Creek eyes. Her opportunity came in late October when Mary Henderson appeared at the schoolhouse just as Teresa was dismissing the children for the day. "I have a favor to ask," Mary said. "My husband and I are hosting a dinner party Saturday night for some of the neighboring ranchers and their wives. I would love it if you would come. You could meet more people from the area, and it would give us a chance to get to know you better." "I would be honored," Teresa said, meaning it. "Wonderful. We eat at 6. I will send Isaac to pick you up in the buggy around 5 if that is acceptable. The ranch is about 10 miles out, too far to walk." Teresa's pulse quickened at the thought of spending time alone with Isaac, even if it was just a drive to and from the ranch. "That would be fine. Thank you for inviting me." Saturday arrived sunny and cool, the October air crisp with the promise of autumn. Teresa wore her best dress, the dark green calico, and brushed her hair until it gleamed. She twisted it into an elegant knot at the nape of her neck and pinned her mother's cameo brooch at her throat. Isaac arrived precisely at 5, driving a neat buggy pulled by a handsome bay mare. He stepped down to help Teresa up, and his eyes widened when he saw her. "You look lovely," he said simply. "Thank you. You look very nice yourself." They set off down the road toward the Diamond S, the mare's hooves beating a steady rhythm against the packed earth. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable, broken only by the creak of the buggy wheels and the distant call of a hawk. "How are you finding teaching?" Isaac asked after a while. "I love it," Teresa said, and realized she meant it. "The children are wonderful. Challenging sometimes, but wonderful. I feel like I am actually making a difference in their lives. Tommy Henderson adores you. He told me you are the best teacher he has ever had. He has only had 2 teachers, from what I understand, so the competition is not particularly fierce." Teresa laughed. "But he is a sweet boy. All the children are. You are good with them, patient. My mother was a teacher before she married, and she always said patience was the most important quality for teaching young minds." They talked about his mother, about Teresa's mother, about the small similarities in their childhoods, despite the very different circumstances. The 10 miles passed quickly, and before Teresa knew it, they were pulling up in front of a large ranch house with a wide porch and smoke curling from the chimney. The dinner party was a warm, lively affair. There were 3 other couples besides the Hendersons, all of them welcoming and friendly. Teresa found herself seated between Isaac and Mary, across from a cattle rancher named Bill Morton and his wife Sarah. The conversation ranged from politics to weather to the latest news from back east, and Teresa held her own, her education and quick wit serving her well. She was acutely aware of Isaac beside her, of his arm occasionally brushing hers when he reached for his water glass, of the way he laughed at her jokes and included her in the conversation when the men started talking about cattle breeding in terms she did not quite understand. After dinner, Mary led the women to the parlor while the men retired to the study for brandy and cigars. Teresa listened to the other women talk about their children and their households, contributing when appropriate but mostly just absorbing the easy camaraderie between them. When the men rejoined them an hour later, Mary suggested music. Sarah Morton turned out to have a beautiful singing voice, and she led them through several popular songs while Mary played the piano. Isaac stood next to Teresa near the fireplace, and at some point during the third song his hand found hers. Teresa's breath caught. She did not pull away. His fingers were warm, his palms slightly calloused, and the simple touch sent heat racing through her veins. They stood like that through the rest of the concert, hands clasped, neither looking at the other but both intensely aware of the connection between them. The party broke up around 10, with the guests thanking the Hendersons and heading for their respective wagons and buggies. Isaac helped Teresa into the buggy and they set off into the cool night. The moon was nearly full, bathing the landscape in silver light. They were halfway back to Wilcox when Isaac pulled the buggy to a stop. He turned to Teresa, his face serious in the moonlight. "I need to say something, and I hope you will not think me too forward." Teresa's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What is it?" "I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the day I found you walking across the desert. I know we have not known each other long, but I feel something when I am with you, something I have never felt with anyone else. I would like permission to court you properly, if you would allow it." Joy and fear warred in Teresa's chest. "What about Catherine Winters?" "I have never courted Catherine Winters, despite her assumptions to the contrary. I have no interest in her, and I made that clear to her father last week when he approached me about a potential match." Isaac reached out and took Teresa's hand. "You are the only woman I want to court. The only woman I have wanted since the moment I saw you." Teresa looked into his eyes and saw sincerity, hope, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, you have my permission." Isaac's smile was radiant. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "You have made me very happy, Teresa." They continued the drive back to Wilcox, but now they talked freely, laughing and sharing stories and learning each other with the eager intensity of new lovers. By the time they reached her uncle's house, Teresa felt as though she had known Isaac for years instead of weeks. He helped her down from the buggy and walked her to the door. "May I take you to dinner tomorrow after church?" he asked. "I would like that very much. Until tomorrow, then." He tipped his hat to her, his eyes warm, and drove away into the night. Teresa floated into the house, too happy to sleep. She lay in bed replaying every word, every touch, every moment of the evening. She was falling in love, she realized, perhaps had already fallen. It was terrifying and exhilarating and wonderful all at once. The next 6 weeks were the happiest Teresa had ever known. Isaac courted her with old-fashioned courtesy and genuine affection. He took her to dinner, to church socials, on long drives through the countryside. They talked about everything and nothing, discovering shared opinions on books and politics and the nature of God. They argued good-naturedly about whether Missouri or Arizona had better sunsets. They sat together on her uncle's porch in the evenings and watched the stars come out. Douglas approved of the match wholeheartedly. "Isaac Sullivan is a good man," he told Teresa. "Hard-working, honest kind. Your father would have liked him." The town, however, was divided. Most people were happy for Teresa and Isaac, but a vocal minority, led by Catherine Winters and her father, made their disapproval known. Banker Winters made it clear that he thought Isaac was making a mistake, throwing away his chance at a prosperous future for a nobody schoolteacher with no money and no connections. Teresa tried not to let it bother her, but the whispers and the cold looks from certain quarters stung. Isaac, however, seemed completely unbothered. "Let them talk," he said when Teresa mentioned it. "We know what we have, and that is all that matters." In mid-November, Isaac took Teresa on a picnic to a beautiful spot along the San Pedro River. They spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree and ate the lunch Mary Henderson had packed for them. Afterward, they walked along the riverbank, hand in hand, talking quietly. "I have been thinking about the future," Isaac said. "About what I want my life to look like." "What do you want?" Teresa asked. "I want my own ranch. Not a huge spread, just enough land for a decent herd and a good house. I want to build something that will last, something I can pass on to my children." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I want you to be part of that future, Teresa. I know it is too soon, that we have only known each other a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you." Tears sprang to Teresa's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have loved you since the day you gave me your canteen and made sure I got safely to town." Isaac pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "Marry me," Isaac said. "I know I do not have much to offer right now, but I am saving my wages and I have been looking at land for sale. In another year, maybe two, I could have enough for a down payment on a small ranch. We would have to live simply at first, but I swear to you I will work hard and provide for you and any children we might have." "Yes," Teresa said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you. I do not care about having a big ranch or lots of money. I just want to build a life with you." They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally returned to the buggy, they were both grinning like fools. Isaac drove Teresa directly to her uncle's house and asked Douglas formally for permission to marry her. Douglas gave it gladly, shaking Isaac's hand and pulling Teresa into a hug. They decided to wait until spring to marry, giving Isaac time to save more money and giving Teresa time to finish out the school year. The engagement was announced at church the following Sunday, to a mix of congratulations and a few sour looks from the Winters family. The winter passed in a haze of happiness and planning. Teresa continued teaching while Isaac worked long hours at the Diamond S, saving every penny he could. On Sundays, they would spend the afternoon together, sometimes at her uncle's house, sometimes at the Hendersons' ranch, sometimes just driving through the countryside and dreaming about their future. In January, Isaac found a piece of land for sale about 12 miles northeast of Wilcox. It was 200 acres of good grazing land with a small creek running through it, and a stand of cottonwood trees that would provide shade for a house. The owner was an elderly man who wanted to move to California to be near his daughter, and he was willing to sell for a fair price with a low down payment. Isaac took Teresa to see it on a cold, clear Sunday afternoon. They stood on a small rise overlooking the property, and Isaac painted a picture with words of the house they would build, the cattle they would raise, the life they would create together. "It is perfect," Teresa breathed. "When can we buy it?" "I am meeting with the owner and the land office next week. If everything goes through, it will be ours by the end of the month." They celebrated that night with Douglas and the Hendersons, toasting the future with apple cider and making plans. Mary Henderson gave Teresa advice on setting up a household on a budget, and Douglas promised to give them a generous discount on all their supplies from the store. The land purchase went through in late January, and Isaac became the proud owner of 200 acres of Arizona territory. He spent every spare moment at the property, clearing a spot for the house and starting to dig the foundation. Teresa helped when she could, on weekends and after school, and slowly their dream began to take shape. They set the wedding date for the last Saturday in April, after the school year ended. Teresa and Mary Henderson spent long hours sewing a wedding dress from white muslin, with lace that Douglas ordered special from a catalog. Isaac ordered a new suit from the tailor in Wilcox and polished his boots until they shone. The week before the wedding, disaster struck. Isaac was working on the ranch house foundation when his horse spooked at a rattlesnake and bolted. Isaac, who had been holding the reins, was dragged several yards before he managed to let go. He ended up with a badly sprained wrist, a gash on his forehead that required stitches, and bruised ribs. Teresa nearly cried when she saw him, his face pale under the bandages. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice shaking. "But I was not," Isaac said, catching her hand with his good one. "I am fine, Teresa, just a little banged up. It will not stop me from marrying you on Saturday," and it did not. Isaac stood at the altar with his wrist wrapped and a bandage on his forehead, but his smile was radiant as he watched Teresa walk down the aisle on her uncle's arm. They spoke their vows in front of the whole town, promising to love and cherish each other for as long as they both lived. The reception was held in the churchyard, with tables of food and a dance platform set up for the celebration. Teresa danced with her new husband, her heart so full of joy she thought it might burst. They were married, truly married, and nothing could ever change that. They spent their wedding night in a room at the Wilcox Hotel, the nicest accommodation the town had to offer. Isaac was gentle and patient, and Teresa fell asleep in his arms feeling cherished and loved and happier than she had ever been. The next morning, they loaded their few possessions into a wagon borrowed from the Diamond S and drove out to their new home. The house was not finished yet, just the foundation and the frame of the walls, so they would be living in a small cabin that had been on the property when Isaac bought it. It was rough and small, just 2 rooms, but Teresa did not care. It was theirs, their first home together. They worked side by side through that first spring and summer, building their house and starting their herd with cattle Isaac purchased with his savings. It was hard work, harder than anything Teresa had ever done, but she loved it. She loved the feel of accomplishment at the end of a long day, the pride of looking at what they had built together, the simple joy of falling into bed beside her husband each night. In late June, Teresa realized she was pregnant. She told Isaac one evening as they sat on the porch of their still unfinished house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Are you certain?" Isaac asked, his voice filled with wonder. "As certain as I can be. I think the baby will come in February." Isaac pulled her into his arms and held her close, his face buried in her hair. "We are going to be parents," he said, and she could hear the joy and fear and excitement in his voice. "Teresa, we are going to have a baby." They told Douglas and the Hendersons the next Sunday, and the news was greeted with hugs and congratulations and offers of help. Mary Henderson immediately took Teresa under her wing, giving her advice about pregnancy and childbirth, and all the things Teresa would need for the baby. The rest of the summer and fall passed in a blur of activity. They finished the house just before the first snow, a sturdy structure with 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a parlor. It was not fancy, but it was solid and well built and warm. Teresa spent her days setting up their home, sewing baby clothes, and helping Isaac with the ranch work when she could. In late January, with the baby due any day, a winter storm rolled in. The snow fell thick and fast, piling up in drifts against the house. Isaac was worried about Teresa giving birth during the storm with no help available, but she reassured him that women had been having babies in worse conditions than this since the beginning of time. Her labor started on a cold February morning, while snow continued to fall outside. Isaac rode through the storm to fetch Mary Henderson, who came despite the weather with her bag of supplies and her calm, capable presence. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the day and into the night, but finally, just after midnight, Teresa gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him James Douglas Sullivan, after both their fathers. He had Isaac's dark hair and Teresa's blue eyes, and a pair of lungs that could wake the dead when he was hungry. Isaac held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, and Teresa watched them together and felt her heart might overflow with love. The years that followed were full of hard work and joy in equal measure. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. They added to their herd each year, built a proper barn, dug a well that provided fresh water year-round. Teresa kept a vegetable garden and chickens, sold eggs in town for extra money, and raised their son with love and firmness. When James was 3, Teresa gave birth to twin daughters, Grace and Eleanor. 2 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Thomas after Isaac's father. The house that had seemed so spacious when they first moved in suddenly felt cramped with 4 young children, so Isaac added 2 more bedrooms and expanded the kitchen. Life was not always easy. There were droughts that killed their pasture grass and forced them to sell off part of the herd. There was the winter when all 4 children came down with influenza, and Teresa and Isaac spent sleepless weeks nursing them back to health. There was the year the bank in Wilcox failed, and they lost a significant portion of their savings. But through it all, they had each other. Isaac and Teresa's love deepened over the years, growing from the passionate intensity of new love into something richer and more enduring. They learned each other's rhythms, how to fight fair and make up quickly, how to support each other through disappointments and celebrate successes together. Douglas remained a constant presence in their lives, the beloved uncle and grandfather who spoiled the children and gave Teresa and Isaac advice, whether they wanted it or not. He lived to see all 4 of his great nieces and nephews born, and when he died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68, the whole town mourned him. Teresa inherited the general store, and after much discussion, she and Isaac decided to hire a manager to run it. The income from the store, combined with the ranch, gave them a financial security they had never had before. They were able to send all 4 children to good schools, to expand the ranch, to build the life they had dreamed of that day by the San Pedro River so many years ago. The children grew. James became a serious, studious boy who loved books and learning. The twins were as different as night and day despite being identical in appearance, Grace quiet and artistic while Eleanor was loud and adventurous. Thomas was the charmer, the one who could talk his way out of trouble with a smile and a well-placed compliment. In 1902, when James was 18 and preparing to leave for college in Tucson, Teresa and Isaac stood on the porch of their house and watched the sunset together as they had done countless times over the years. "You ever regret it?" Isaac asked. "Marrying a poor cowboy with nothing but dreams and determination." Teresa turned to look at her husband. He was 44 now, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He was still the handsomest man she had ever seen. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me everything I ever wanted. A home, a family, a life full of purpose and love. What more could I possibly want? I just want to make sure you are happy. You gave up teaching, gave up living in town. You work so hard here." "I am teaching," Teresa pointed out. "I am teaching our children, and that is more important than any schoolroom ever was. And this ranch, this life we built together, is more than I ever dreamed of having. I love you, Isaac Sullivan. I loved you when you were a cowboy with nothing but a horse and a dream, and I love you now. That has never changed." Isaac pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and she melted into him just as she had that first time by the river. Some things, she thought, never changed, and that was exactly as it should be. The years continued to pass. James went off to college and became a teacher, following in his mother's footsteps. He married a sweet girl from Tucson and brought her home to meet the family. Grace discovered a talent for painting and sold her artwork to galleries in Phoenix and Santa Fe. Elena shocked everyone by becoming a nurse and moving to San Francisco. Thomas, the baby, surprised no one by staying on the ranch and taking over more and more of the daily operations as Isaac's arthritis made the physical labor harder. In 1910, when Teresa was 49 and Isaac was 52, they became grandparents for the first time. James and his wife had a daughter, and when they brought the tiny baby to the ranch for the first time, Teresa held her granddaughter and felt the circle of life complete itself. She thought about her own mother, who had died before seeing her granddaughters, and her father, who had never met his son-in-law or his grandchildren. She wished they could have known the family she had created, could have seen how her life had turned out. But she also knew they would have been proud. She had built a good life, a meaningful life, filled with love and purpose and the satisfaction of work well done. She had raised children who were kind and capable and ready to make their own mark on the world. She had loved one man with her whole heart for nearly 30 years and been loved just as deeply in return. On a warm April evening in 1920, Teresa and Isaac sat on the porch of the house they had built together nearly 30 years earlier. They were both in their late 50s now, their hair silver, their bodies marked by years of hard work and the passing of time. But when Isaac reached for Teresa's hand, the touch still sent warmth through her, and when she smiled at him, his heart still skipped a beat. Around them, their ranch sprawled across land they had expanded over the years to nearly 500 acres. Thomas and his wife lived in a house they had built on the far end of the property and ran the day-to-day operations of the ranch. James visited regularly from Tucson with his wife and their 3 children. Grace lived in Santa Fe but came home for holidays, her paintings now hanging in galleries across the Southwest. Elena sent letters from San Francisco, where she worked in a hospital and had recently become engaged to a doctor. "We did well," Isaac said, gesturing to the land spread out before them. "Better than I ever thought possible when I was a 25-year-old cowboy with nothing but ambition." "We did very well," Teresa agreed. 4 wonderful children, 5 grandchildren and counting, a successful ranch and 30 years of marriage. I would say we have been blessed beyond measure. "Do you remember the day we met?" Isaac asked. "You walking across the desert with an empty canteen and too much pride to show how scared you were. I remember thinking you were either going to save me or murder me, and I was so thirsty I almost did not care which." Teresa laughed. "Thank you for choosing to save me. Thank you for letting me. Thank you for saying yes when I asked to court you, and for marrying me even though I could not give you much at the time, and for building this life with me. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Teresa Sullivan." "You are the best thing that ever happened to me too," Teresa said softly. "I was so lost when my father died. I thought my life was over, that I would spend the rest of my days as a burden on my uncle, or in some loveless marriage of convenience. But then you came riding up beside me and everything changed. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love, real love, the kind that lasts a lifetime. I could not have asked for more." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. The desert air cooled, bringing the scent of sage and creosote. In the distance, cattle lowed softly, and somewhere a coyote called to its mate. This was home, Teresa thought. Not just the house or the land, but this moment, this feeling of completeness and peace. This was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had never known to dream of when she was a frightened young woman walking across the empty desert toward an uncertain future. "I love you," she said, squeezing Isaac's hand. "I love you too," he replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. Always have, always will. They watched the stars come out one by one, filling the desert sky with their ancient light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, as every day did. But tonight, they were simply two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life worth living, a love worth having, a family worth cherishing. And that, Teresa thought as she rested her head on her husband's shoulder, was the greatest blessing of all. Not the land or the house or even the children and grandchildren, as precious as they all were. The greatest blessing was this man beside her, who had seen her at her most vulnerable and chose to love her anyway. Who had worked beside her through droughts and disappointments, who had celebrated victories with her and mourned losses. Who had been her partner, her lover, her best friend for 3 decades, and showed no signs of stopping. The night grew darker, the stars brighter, and still they sat together on the porch, two hearts beating as one, their love as enduring as the desert itself, as constant as the stars above. This was their story, their life, their happily ever after, and it was more than enough. Years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. Teresa and Isaac moved a bit slower now, delegated more of the ranch work to Thomas and the hired hands, but they remained active and involved. Teresa kept her vegetable garden, tended her roses, and wrote long letters to her children and grandchildren. Isaac still rode the property every day, checking fences and water sources, unable to fully let go of the land he had built from nothing. In 1925, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a huge party at the ranch. All 4 of their children came home, bringing spouses and children and stories of their lives. Friends from Wilcox and neighboring ranches filled the house and yard. Mary Henderson, now in her 70s and widowed for several years, sat on the porch with Teresa and watched the celebration with misty eyes. "You know, I told you that boy was smitten with you the first time I saw you together," Mary said. "I knew you two would make it." "You did indeed," Teresa said, smiling. "You were right about many things, Mary. I am grateful for your friendship all these years. And I for yours. You were good for Isaac and he was good for you. That is the way it should be." The party lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Isaac danced with Teresa under the stars, just as he had at their wedding 40 years earlier, and she felt just as cherished, just as loved as she had that day. In 1928, Teresa turned 67 and Isaac turned 70. They were both in good health for their ages, though Isaac's arthritis had worsened, and Teresa's eyesight was not what it used to be. They spent their days in quiet companionship, reading together in the evenings, taking slow walks around the property, entertaining the stream of grandchildren and now great-grandchildren who came to visit. One evening in early autumn, as they sat on the porch watching yet another spectacular sunset, Isaac turned to Teresa with a thoughtful expression. "If you could go back and change anything, would you?" Teresa considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "Every choice, every hardship, every moment of joy led us here. I would not change a single thing because it all gave us this life." "What about you?" "The same," Isaac said. "Even the hard times were worth it because we went through them together. I have had a good life, Teresa. A very good life. And it has all been because of you." "Not because of me," Teresa corrected gently. "With me. We built this life together as partners. That is what made it work." Isaac smiled and pulled her close, and they watched the sun sink below the horizon in comfortable silence. Two people who had loved each other well for more than 4 decades and planned to keep loving each other for whatever time they had left. The years grew gentler still. They moved less, slept more, spent long hours simply being together. Their children worried and fussed, but Teresa and Isaac were content. They had lived full, rich lives. They had loved well and been loved in return. They had built something that would last beyond them, in the form of their children and grandchildren, and the ranch that would continue through the generations. In the spring of 1932, Isaac fell ill with pneumonia. At 74, his body did not have the strength to fight it off, and despite the doctor's best efforts and Teresa's devoted nursing, he slipped away on a quiet April morning with the sun streaming through the bedroom window and Teresa holding his hand. "I love you," she whispered as his breathing grew shallow. "I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you until my last breath. Thank you for everything, my darling. Thank you for every moment." Isaac's eyes opened one last time and he smiled at her. "Love you," he breathed. "Always." And then he was gone. Teresa buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch with a simple headstone that read, "Isaac Sullivan, 1858–1932, beloved husband, father, grandfather." She stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left, remembering the young cowboy who had slowed his horse to match the pace of a woman walking alone across empty country. He had saved her life that day in more ways than one, and she had loved him with everything she had for nearly 50 years. The grief was profound, a physical ache that settled into her bones and never fully left. But Teresa was not alone. Her children gathered around her, and Thomas insisted she move into the main house with him and his wife so they could care for her. She lived another 6 years, watching her great-grandchildren grow, tending her roses and writing letters filled with stories of the old days. On a warm September evening in 1938, Teresa Lawson Sullivan passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 77. She was buried next to Isaac on the hill, and her headstone read, "Teresa Lawson Sullivan, 1861–1938, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, together forever." Their children saw to it that the ranch stayed in the family, passing it down through the generations. The house Isaac and Teresa built still stood 100 years later, carefully maintained and treasured as a piece of family history. Their love story became legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, a reminder that true love exists, that it endures, and that sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with the simplest acts of kindness. A cowboy slowing his horse to match the pace of a woman walking alone across empty country. A canteen offered. A ride into town given freely. Two souls recognizing each other across the dust and distance and choosing to build a life together. That was how it started, and that was how it endured. A love story written in the desert soil of Arizona, as timeless and enduring as the land itself.